Hey y'all, I'm Angela, and today I'm going to be doing a reading wrap-up for January. Is it mid-February at this point? Yeah. But you know what? Things happened and we're trying and we're getting back into it. So, this January I read 10 books, which for me is like a lot of books, and many of those books were short. But it was also more reading than I usually do, as evidenced by the fact that we are now slightly more than a week into February, and I have read one book. I read a whole bunch of books. I'm going to talk about most of them in this video. I'm not going to talk about all of them because one of them I deeply, deeply disliked. And then two of them were nonfiction books that I am still thinking about. So maybe I'll talk about them later, but I'm not going to talk about them today. So the first book that I read this year was actually a reread of Emma by Jane Austen. And I actually reread that right after rereading Pride and Prejudice. Emma had been my favorite Jane Austen novel. It definitely was not this time. I liked Emma a lot less and Pride and Prejudice a lot more. For me, Emma is very much a novel that is about sort of the importance of kindness and investing in our community, even when that is maybe frustrating or less than rewarding. And I don't know if that's just a message that I needed less now, or a message that was less exciting for me in this time in my life. But definitely I still really enjoyed it, but I enjoyed it less. I think part of what happened too was that I know more about the time period now, and so that a lot of the premise is like, oh, Emma is this rich girl that's making very poor choices, but now that I feel like I understand her time and culture better, I was able to fully appreciate how bad the choices were that she was making, and it haunted me a little bit. So still very much enjoyed Emma. I absolutely adore Knightley, and I really like the relationship she ends up in the end, but it definitely resonated with me less. And I don't know, I'm curious. I'll probably read it again someday, and I'll see if I like it more than I did this time. I hope I do, because I really adored Emma the first time I read it. But maybe it's just that I like saw myself in her, and now maybe I've grown as a person or something. That's maybe hopeful. The second book I read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which was very buzzy a couple years ago, or a year ago. I don't know how time works, but I wasn't really on or like watching BookTube at that time, so I actually didn't hear about it until quite recently. It's told in like an interview style with this young reporter interviewing this very famous older actress about her career and also her 7 husbands. I started this book at 10 o'clock at night right before I went to bed, and then I finished it at 3 o'clock in the morning so I read it in like one sitting. So while on the one hand I can be like, I don't think that this book is really one that I'm going to carry with me, which is true, it's also a book that I literally couldn't put down. So take with that what you will. I really liked Evelyn. I found sort of that period of time of shifting from the studio system that Hollywood used to be under to like more modern film stuff to be really interesting. I'm not totally sure about all the history. There were a couple of points where I was but most of it I really enjoyed. I really liked Evelyn. I really liked the format, and I really do think that if you are someone that's interested in like film history or like queer history, I mean not queer history so much as like the experience of being like a bisexual woman in the past, or you like the interview format, this is a really good one to pick up. If those are things that interest you and you're in a bit of a reading slump, I think that this book would be amazing for that. The third book that I read in January was actually an audiobook. It was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, and as I tend to do with memoirs, I listened to it. I was pretty ambivalent about Trevor Noah going in. I probably like him more now. But I'd heard good things about the memoir, so I ended up reading it, and I really, really enjoyed it, and it was just a really interesting book. So it's about his childhood growing up in South Africa. It was really interesting, particularly because I haven't read a ton about South Africa, but basically everything I have read is all like pre the end of apartheid, and then most of the South Africans I know are quite young and were born free, so I haven't really encountered anything about that straddling. But when Trevor Noah was born, it's several years, I think like 8 or 9 before apartheid ended, and because his dad is white and his mom is black, he is technically illegal, so was really talking about sort of that. And then a lot of other things, it's a really interesting and thoughtful memoir. He talks about race and gender and faith and all kinds of things in really interesting ways. His conversations about race and language in particular were really interesting because he was a person that both fit into a lot of categories growing up and also fit into no categories, and that was really interesting to listen to. And it was just so interesting to listen to him talk about this period of transition both for him and for his country, and overall I just really enjoyed it. The next book that I read, which I absolutely adored, I would be pretty surprised if it doesn't end up on my top books of the year, was Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, which was, I think it came out in like 2014, 2015, and it was a pretty big book at the time, but I haven't really heard much about it since then. It tells the story of a family, so it follows these two half-sisters. They don't actually know that they're half-sisters, but they're half-sisters who are born in Ghana, and one of them stays there and is married to a white slave trader, and then the other one is captured and sold into slavery, and then goes across in the Atlantic slave trade to the United States. And so it's basically a series of short stories following both of their children for a period of about 200 years, so it's sort of like overlapping short stories, and it's really beautiful. It spans 200 years and 2 continents, and it just does such a good job, at least to me, of sort of contextualizing what that history looks like and the ways in which things compound on each other, and it builds on, you know, everything from colonialism to the crack epidemic, and moves through, in the United States, chattel slavery, and then into Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and just all of these different layers of history across sort of these 2 different continents in a way that was really powerful. And when I first heard about this book, I thought it was going to be really long because it's like, oh, you're following 200 years of history and all of these families. It's actually like 300 pages, which part of the reason why I put it off was because I've been meaning to read this book for literally years, but I thought it was like a 700-page epic, and I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for 700 pages of slavery now. It's not. It's obviously really difficult material, emotionally, but it is only a 300-page novel, so it's very doable sort of from that standpoint. And she just does such a good job of contextualizing things. I felt an appreciation for sort of time and history at the end of that book that in a way I don't think I've felt before. It's definitely one of the best books about American slavery that I've ever read. It's not just about that, but it definitely is about that. And on top of that, she's just insanely talented, and it's really well written, and it's just a solid novel on top of like everything else. In sort of a complete tonal shift, the next book I read was Gideon the Ninth by Tamysn Muir, which has been a really buzzy book, and is basically lesbian necromancers in space. I don't know how to talk about Gideon the Ninth, in part because I don't feel like I'm done processing Gideon the Ninth, but it was really enjoyable, lots of fun. It's both really insular and then the world feels like deep at the same time, which I really enjoyed. It is a lot of like people in a creepy house, so that's definitely a vibe. But if you are at all interested in lesbian necromancers in space, then probably it's worth trying. Don't know how I feel about it, honestly, but I'm absolutely gonna read the next one when it comes out. And I absolutely adored Gideon herself. I think that this book does a really good job of sort of our protagonists. Our central characters that we're following are like 18, 19, and they felt very much like teenagers. I don't know if I enjoyed it. This book was a lot of fun. It may have also been other things, but it was a lot of fun, and I'm definitely reading the next one when it comes out. Immediately after Gideon the Ninth, I read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. So part of what I'm trying to do this year is sort of read in more genres. I tend to read a lot of like classics and contemporaries and science fiction and fantasy and basically nothing else. So I figured trying Agatha Christie out would be a good idea. I tend not to read a lot of mystery because I don't think I do the genre right. In that I'm pretty sure that you're supposed to try and solve the mystery, and I definitely don't. This novel, which is basically like 10 people in a murder house, essentially. It's not really a spoiler, that's the premise, right? So it's 10 people go to this house, and then someone starts killing them off one by one, and they're trying to figure out who did it so that they don't die. And it was very, very readable. It's very short. It's, again, a book I read in essentially a sitting. And I kind of was trying to find out who did it, just not logically, but emotionally. And overall, I really enjoyed it. Will we try another Agatha Christie novel again in the future? I would guess. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. And it was interesting to read following Gideon the Ninth because they're both kind of a bunch of random people locked in a creepy house. Those parallels were fun too. I liked reading those books back to back. Last book that I wanted to talk about just briefly, because again, I don't totally know what I should say about it, is the Starless CEO by Erin Morgenstern. I want to start off with the very big caveat that this is not really a book for me, and that hands down, probably the thing that gets talked about the most with this book is the gorgeous setting descriptions. Like, it's very much a book about description, and I, as a reader, do not visualize at all. Which meant that there were many times when I was reading through things that I was like, this is probably objectively the best part of this book. But I was like actively skimming because I don't really visualize, so I didn't really care. So, that sort of caveat at the beginning, I am not the audience for this book. That said, the protagonist, Zachary, I really liked. He was a sweetheart, and the reason that I did not DNF this book that was clearly not for me was because I was very invested in Zachary and what happened to him. It starts with Zachary, who's getting his master's in video game studies. That's not the actual name, but that's basically what he's doing, is video game studies, and then he gets like wrapped into this like secret society stuff with this like magical Starless CEO. Some things happen and some things don't happen, and yeah, the plot definitely did not work for me. There were various things about this book that did not totally work for me. That said, I really did enjoy a lot of the characters. I also very much enjoyed the romance. I feel like it was maybe the most telly romance plot I've encountered. Very much like, here is a person, and here is this person, and they both find the other person attractive. But I was here for that. Like, I enjoyed it. The thing that for me really did not land was that I think that this book brought up a lot of really interesting questions around story and the way that we think about story. It's very much a love letter to story, and it raised some really interesting questions about like sort of the romanticizing of stories, I think, and like, do we preserve everything? How important is that act of preserving for the sake of preserving, which are things that, as both one of those kids that definitely grew up sort of devastated that magic didn't exist, and also like continually ready for my first adventure, and that also like as someone that thinks about history a lot, are things that are very interesting to me. The thing about this book was I felt like it raised a lot of really interesting questions about like, what are both the benefits and the dangers of romanticizing storytelling and all of these things, and then for me it did not really answer those questions in the kind of way that I would like to see. That said, I think that this is actually one of my favorite handlings of sort of that like adult grappling with magic now that they are an adult, and an adult portal fantasy, I guess. I feel like I just strung some adjectives together, but I feel like this was that, and while it did not work for me, it also worked more than the other books that I have read that have done it. So there's that. Probably, if you don't visualize things, this is not the greatest book to read. But Zachary was a sweetheart, and I wanted to know he was okay, so I kept reading. And that was January. I can already tell that February is going to be a lot less reading for me, but I had a really good month, sort of reading-wise. Probably I was like writing and doing various things less than I should have done because I was reading so much. Please let me know what your favorite book that you read in January was down in the comments, and happy reading, everybody.